Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, despite hunger, child malnutrition, and widespread poverty, the island nation of Madagascar often misses out on humanitarian assistance. So, why is that? Stay with us to find out. We on the stream have never done a show about Madagascar. Are we part of the problem? I'm hoping that in the next 30 minutes we'll be part of the solution.
I hope so too.
Malika Bilal, what do you have?
Though it's interesting, someone on Twitter did mention that the channel has done things on Madagascar, but on vanilla production. So that's why we asked our community what came to mind when they think of Madagascar. We got answers like this. This is one on Twitter, vanilla. Lemurs, and how globalization hasn't elevated all nations equally. So a range of things in that answer. We want to hear from you at home as well. You can tweet us your questions, your thoughts, #AJStream.
Hi, my name is George Abungo. I'm a professor of archaeology and heritage studies, University of Mauritius, and also Kelabungo Heritage Consultant. I am on this stream.
Madagascar is the fourth biggest island in the world, and it sits just off the southeastern coast of the African continent. It's famous for beautiful beaches, rainforests, and thousands of plants and exotic animals that exist nowhere else on the earth. Many are also familiar with the name Madagascar through the popular DreamWorks animation movies and TV shows. But few know about this former French colony's humanitarian crisis. Madagascar is one of the least developed countries in the world. Almost 3/4 of the population live on less than $2 a day. United Nations agencies are warning that nearly 1.9 million people there don't have enough to eat. Almost half the children under the age of 5 suffer from chronic malnutrition. That's the fourth highest rate in the world. And according to recent reports, families are dealing with food shortages by cutting down on daily meals, taking children out of school, and scavenging for food in the wild. Now, despite this, aid to this African island nation has steadily gone down over the years. Madagascar's ongoing humanitarian crisis often doesn't even make it onto the list of international aid initiatives. So to help us explore why this is happening, we're joined by Willem van Millink. He's Madagascar Country Director at the World Food Programme. Simon Allison, a journalist with the Daily Maverick newspaper. Nima Ali, a community health volunteer, and Luva Rakoto Malala is an editor with Global Voices Online Madagascar. Good to have you here, everybody. Simon, when you go to report in Madagascar, what kind of stories are you covering? Give us an idea of the kind of issues that you're digging into.
Well, the first problem is sort of getting editorial approval to go to Madagascar. You know, in a continent such as Africa, where there are a lot of competing priorities for the news agenda, trying to convince someone that Madagascar is worth covering is actually quite a hard job, because Madagascar's problems are, they are humanitarian in nature, but they aren't necessarily, I don't like to use the word, but sexy. They're not sexy. They're not famine. We're not talking about incredible, distressing visuals of people in poverty a lot of the time. We're talking about chronic malnutrition, which is a long-term disaster, but it doesn't necessarily have the short-term impact that news editors are looking for. So it can be quite hard to motivate for covering places like Madagascar.
Sure. Willem, you're the World Food Programme Country Director in Madagascar. What's your biggest crisis right now? What are you really concerned about?
Right now, we are concerned about the drought in the south. We've had 2 years of not very good rains. The last season, we had in some areas about 75% rain deficit. And we are now starting a new lean season. And we are also forecasting that El Nino, the Nino, weather system will have an even worse effect during this drought. So we are facing a situation where we have an estimated 400,000 people that are severely food insecure.
Tell us about the lean season. What does lean season mean for people in Madagascar?
The lean season means that basically you run out of food and you start eating other food stuff that is available. For example, the fruit of a cactus, so it's called a raqueta here. It's a yellow fruit, and that's abundant right now, and that's a blessing actually, because there are not many other options. And this also means that there is not enough water. And it also means that you will have to wait at least 3 or 4 months until you can access food again, basically.
So, Lova, you heard Willem talk about the lean season, and earlier Simon talked about the malnutrition. When we asked our community again about what they think about Madagascar, we got an answer on Twitter, and this is one that says, we think of a country that cannot feed her citizens. And that's exacerbated by this tweet from Nafizi, who says, drought, floods, cyclones are all deepening the vulnerability of the economically weakened state of Madagascar. So, Lova, how do these natural disasters play into how people are faring where you're from?
Right, I totally agree with those comments on Twitter. We certainly have many challenges, but at some point we have to hold the administration and the previous one accountable for the well-being of its citizens. And this famine thing is not a new problem. It's been here for at least a decade now, and it's been recurrent. And we're certainly very grateful for international aid, because the situation could be much worse without them. But at some point, the administration needs to do something and make sure that all the citizens of Madagascar, especially the one in the southern regions, are being taken care of and not feel like second-class citizens.
I want to show you where we're talking about here. So on here, I've got a Google map. So we have Southern Africa here, Madagascar here. I'm just going to scooting a little bit. 3 clicks should get me here to the capital, Antananarivo. But Nima, for where you are, how are people faring? You deal with the community every single day. How do they manage?
I'm living in the Lake Alotra region, which is it's like 12 hours north of the capital. And it is rain season, but it is not nearly as devastating as the south that Willem was commenting on.
Yeah. So
where I live, those people have rice, and they'll soon run out of rice and run out of cassava and go to other staple foods, like you mentioned.
Yeah. And there's also, there's from what I understand, and maybe Willem, you can help me with this. If you're living on rice and cassava, even if you're eating a lot of it, there's a problem with that, right, Willem?
Yes.
Yes.
That's the majority of the problem I see is the chronic malnutrition, where maybe people are eating, they're still not eating enough calorically, but they're definitely not getting the micronutrients they need and the protein that they need, especially the children.
Sure, Vin, can you explain that a little bit more? Because that's a harder thing to understand. We understand famine, but the idea of being able to eat, but then still bad things happening to you. Explain that.
Yeah, so basically 2 concepts: acute malnutrition and chronic malnutrition. Acute malnutrition, you could define it as, a death sentence. Those are the children with the big bellies, slender arms, and sometimes even red hair and so on. And chronic malnutrition is what you could call also a life sentence. That is the effect of not eating well, especially during the first 2-3 years of a children's life, which has an impact for the rest of his or her life. It means that this person will have less physical capacity, less intellectual capacity, will be more prone to sickness, and basically it means that her life will be shortened. It also means that they will have less economic possibilities. It is not very well known, the chronic malnutrition, but it is getting more and more attention. It's also sometimes called more of a development problem, because you have to work a long time on this subject. You have to work from different aspects: water supplies, food supplies, and micronutrients and proteins were mentioned, but also children's health in health centers. And so it's a complex response. Yeah. The acute malnutrition is rather simple to help if you're at least on time.
Sure. I'm looking here at the Mail and Guardian Africa, and it says by 2030, about 50% of Burundians, Eritreans, Malagasi's and Rwandese will be shorter than they should be. And that's really speaking to just not getting enough nutrients in their diet. Simon, you were in Madagascar a month ago. What did you see?
Well, chronic malnutrition it's hard to see, because we're talking about, the damage is done in kids between 0 and 2 years old mostly, and also between 0 and 5 years old. So these are small kids. You can't necessarily see the physical differences between them and kids getting normal nutrition. But the long-term consequences of this are just horrific. We're talking about entire sections of the population. In Madagascar, it's nearly 1 in 2 children growing up today are going to grow up with reduced brain capacity compared to their peers. Madagascar is an extreme example, but places like South Africa, now South Africa is one of the most developed countries on the African continent, the figure there is 25%. So that's 1 in 4 people in South Africa growing up with reduced mental capacity. This is a long-term disaster for countries in the developing world that are not dealing with chronic malnutrition, and it is not being covered at all. Journalists aren't covering it. NGOs aren't really covering it enough. I really think that this is the greatest long-term public health crisis that the developing world is dealing with, and we need to do something about it very quickly. Otherwise, we're going to start seeing the effects. I think we already have been seeing the effects, because although we haven't been measuring chronic malnutrition for that long, it has been going on for a long time.
Willem, how long have you been in Madagascar for? Yeah, go ahead, Willem.
4 years. 4 years. And I was going to say, you know, one of the interesting things about chronic malnutrition also is that basically we know how to solve it. I mean, it's not really rocket science, you know, and there have been several studies published in the Lancet Journal of Medicine.
Yeah.
And there's also one global initiative called the Scaling Up Nutrition Initiative.
So,
which
Willem,
is trying to do
why
just
are we
that.
talking about it then? You know how to solve it. What are we doing talking about it? Why is it even a problem now?
Well, funding is always, of course, a quick word to come with, but it's also a question of organization, a question of capacity. You have to take into account that Madagascar is a country that has also many other problems. I would say institutional capacity, governance are also major problems. Just take a look at what happens with the minimum salary here. A minimum salary, when you have a job, is about 55 euros, or you know, the equivalent in $60 or so a month for a family of 5, 6, or 7 people, and that's when you have a job. When you don't, you're living with $20, $30.
So the entire country is poor, basically. So we have an entire nation that is impoverished.
According to the World Bank, it is 92% actually of the population live under $2 a day, and it is, according to the World Bank, one of the poorest countries in the world that is not in conflict. So if you exclude Sudan and Central African Republic or Somalia and so on, this is now one of the poorest countries in the world.
Luva, I want to read you a back and forth that we had online between a Malagasy and someone else. So this is Tendro, and he's echoing a point that you raised a little bit earlier in the show. Tendro says someone at the top needs to say, we're in charge, here's the policy, here's the action. Unfortunately, that person is missing from our government. So he got a response. This is Reverend, who says, governments come and pass. When we empower communities to address their own needs, development becomes sustainable. So Tendro responded and he said, well, there are many communities in Madagascar that are trained, that are empowered to manage their own resources, but those issues should be addressed through well thought out government policies. Do you think that there are enough government policies that are well thought out that, like Tendro mentions, to address this? And if not, then how do you go about that?
Oh, absolutely not. I think I'm totally on the side of Tendro here, because the effort of communities locally can only go so far. At some point, with this level of malnutrition, it has to be a national effort, and the disconnect between the capital city and the political leaders in the capital and the southern region is just incredible. The politicians only care for the southern region when it's election time, and that's why there is no coherent policies when it comes to agriculture and just environmental issues there. I think there needs to be a plan. Whatever's been happening in Madagascar, there's always like an emergency type of issues that we need to take care of right away, but there's no plan for the next 5, 10 years. And that's been a recurrent problem with this administration, but also the previous ones.
If I may say something there, I mean, basically I've seen actually many plans in Madagascar, so many documents, and not really bad documents also. And what I've seen is a lack of implementation capacity. And of course, everybody knows also that the government almost does not have any funding right now. Most of the ministries are working with, just paying recurrent costs and salaries plus a little bit more. They don't almost have an implementation capacity. They have not been able to access even, credit from the International Monetary Fund. They wanted to access a $250 million credit. They did not manage. They only managed, maybe, it's still not approved, a $50 million emergency credit facility. But it's also aid in general has been slow to come to Madagascar. We must take into account that Madagascar has had many years of political instability. The last period was extremely long, from 2009 to 2013. Right. That hurt the country enormously. And since then, we would have expected to see more funding coming into the country. It is coming. We see the progress, but very slowly. We have very few donors here present in Madagascar. The island, it is an island. It is rather isolated from the rest of the country. Simon was saying, it's difficult to go to Madagascar. Also, not so, let's say, sexy. There's not a big problems happening. Just not to take all the time, just to mention one thing. Malagasy people are very peaceful people. The harmony is a very high value here. So you will rarely see violence. You see criminality, that's all over the place. But, wars or, conflicts between large groups are rare,
so Willem,
actually.
Willem, Lova, do you buy that? I mean, Willem's given a lot of reasons and context for why Madagascar is in the state it's in right now. Do you buy any of that?
Well, I agree with the fact that there are plans and that implementation is an issue, but I totally disagree with the fact that we should be relying on international aid. At some point, the country needs to take care of itself. International aid has been great for Madagascar, and the work of the WFP is great. But at the end of the day, Madagascar needs to be accountable for its own citizens, and we cannot rely on international aid all the time. That's just something that's not sustainable. And
I absolutely agree with you.
And it's been that way since we've been independent, and it really needs to at some point change. And if you have to take drastic measure to solve this issue, it needs to be done, and that comes from leadership.
Both of those things are true.
Nima first, and then Simon. Nima, go ahead.
I think that the government can increase its accountability and take more charge of its own policies, but the need for aid is still very real. As I worked with the Office of International and the National Office of Nutrition, and there are plans, and there's just no money to implement them. So after securing a private grant, we were able to bring them to the community that I live in and work, and they did a phenomenal job training the auxiliary health workers to go into the smaller villages and train women at a very grassroots level. It's not that people don't have the skill set, they just don't have the resources, the basic gas to get from the regional office to these villages, paying for their housing, the food, the paperwork. And I think the euphemism of the peaceful people is that really a passive culture, honestly. And I feel like having worked here for 2 years, a lot of the women I work with on a community level, I do agree pretty regularly when you present a plan or, let's add a little bit of vitamin A rich foods, and there, women agree, everybody agrees, but it's really the implementation, even beyond a macro level, but on a village level, that is the serious problem. Changing habits is incredibly difficult. And like you said, if there are generations of, I believe generations of people who are really dealing with the devastation of chronic malnutrition, and then having children again, that then will be chronically malnourished.
And Nima, I hear what you're saying. I think there are some people online that would push back against the idea of them being a passive people. This is Lemia online, and she says Madagascar doesn't need aid. It needs internal reform and policy and budgeting. Food redistribution can solve more than aid can. We also got another tweet. This is from Sam Ziel, who says, international aid would only enslave Madagascar, rather empower her people to explore their own resources and create a global marketplace. So, Simon, you hear these tweets, you see what's written here, and in your reporting, what's the sense that you get from people?
Well, it sounds amazing. All these buzzwords, let's have new policy, let's empower people, let's change the situation, let's take charge of our own destiny. It's all wonderful sounding stuff, but in reality, it's a lot harder to do. Lova was saying we need to take drastic measures. He's right, but what are those drastic measures? And if we look at places like Egypt, for example, which had a revolution, they took drastic measures. Is Egypt in a better place today than it was previously? Does Madagascar need those kinds of drastic measures?
Simon, that is a massive leap. Madagascar to Egypt? I can't, it's not even the same set of circumstances or similar circumstances. I'm not even going to let the guests push back on that one. No. I can't let you just get away with that. Lova, help me out here.
Can I make a quick point about the funding issue?
Yeah,
because we always say that there's no money, but right now there is a study that just came up in Forbes magazine Africa, and it shows that 4 of the most of the wealthiest people from the sub-Saharan African continent in French-speaking countries are from Madagascar. They weigh almost like 2 billion, just the 4 of them. And shouldn't there be something that they can do? Because when you see the devastation that is in the region, the 4 richest of the continent are from Madagascar. The insanity here is, how come those people don't feel the urge to at least do something? Because just 1/10 of what's going on there.
Why do you think, Lova? You must have thought about this a while. Why do you think? What do you think this is?
Well, because again, it comes to disconnect. It's not in your backyard, because you can live your own life as one of the elites or so-called elite of Madagascar, and it's very easy to look away from what's going on in the south because it's far.
If I could come on Lova's earlier comment,
yes,
on that aid is not going to be the solution for the country. I completely agree. I mean, in the end, this country will take off with other measures, with economic possibilities, really, not with aid. Aid is not going, but aid is providing this capacity that we were talking earlier for people to make use of those opportunities. So, and coming also to the fact that there's aid has been slow, which you're mentioning. I mean, the OECD classifies Madagascar as an aid orphan country. It divides developing countries, in 2 groups: the darlings, the ones who receive a lot of aid, and
give us an example of a darling, so that we know the different extremes.
Well, just across the sea here, Mozambique has been for a very long time the darling. I mean, almost every donor has been working in Mozambique.
There are a lot of organizations in Mozambique, I know that. So why is Madagascar, briefly in a sentence, Willem, why is it an aid orphan? Why do you think?
Oh, you want it in a sentence? Well, I think the fact that it has very little relationship.
Nima's horrified that I would even suggest that. Go ahead, Willem.
But the fact that it has very few relationships with the neighbors. For example, it only has 5% of the economic exchange with southern African countries. So the fact that it's an island it means it's already isolated.
Sure.
So
the geography doesn't help.
Experience of investing aid in Madagascar has also not been very positive. I know that there are quite a few donors that are a bit, let's say, tired, of having invested money and not having seen many results. And that has been also complicated by recurrent. Every 7-10 years, we have this political crisis, which clearly indicate that there is a governance problem in this country.
All right, Willem, you gave us a sense of why Madagascar was off people's radar in terms of aid and coming to the assistance of this island nation. Malika, what do you have before we go to the post-show?
Well, amidst all of that, we did ask people online what would they like people to know about Madagascar. We got this answer from Nanjala, who says that it really is one of the most spectacular places on the planet and that the Malagasy people are a major part of that.
Willem and Saima and Nima and Lova are coming to our online stream discussion at stream.aljazeera.com. Hopefully see you there. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care. Hello again, this is the Stream's online post show. We've been talking about why a crisis-stricken country like Madagascar is often overlooked when it comes to international aid. Picking up with our guests where we left off. Nima, what did you want to say?
Oh, I wanted to ask Simon, you said that Madagascar is not sexy enough in terms of its disasters. I just feel like being here, there's droughts, there's flooding, there's cyclones, there's bubonic plague. I mean, what else could there possibly be? I just like what is needed really, and the other thing is I don't understand how the like environmental aspects of I think like the beauty and the uniqueness of Madagascar is never played out in terms of wanting to preserve that history.
No, it's a good point, and I think in terms of the environment. You know, Madagascar's flora and fauna, the lemurs. I can sell that story to an editor any day of the week. They're interested in that kind of stuff. But the humanitarian disaster, you know, my feeling is that there's no one humanitarian disaster that, you know, Madagascar's problem is there are several humanitarian disasters all working in coordination with each other to create a major disaster. That's a difficult story to tell. The fact that there's droughts in one part of the country and there's floods in another part of the country, it doesn't make intuitive sense. It's not like there is one earthquake which caused massive devastation. We can understand that. Madagascar requires a little bit of nuance and subtlety and a sophisticated understanding of the various different elements that are going on. And it's quite a hard story to sell, and it requires, in terms of media, it requires media outlets that are that allow their journalists to tell longer stories. You know, you need to tell it in a couple thousand words. You can't tell it in a 300-word soundbite.
It's a complex story to tell.
You know, Simon, I'm so glad you mentioned that because we actually got a comment online that's really similar. This is Tendra, who says, it feels like wildlife conservation issues, i.e. tortoises, rosewood, timber trafficking, get more attention than humanitarian crises. Example, SOS lemurs. There's a campaign for that. There is not an SOS people of Madagascar. And so this is the SOS lemurs campaign that he mentioned. It was World Lemur Day not too long ago. But of course, as he mentions, there's not one for the humans, the people of Madagascar. So there's a reason why in this video comment. Lova, I'd like you to have a listen to Tamara.
The reasons Madagascar is not receiving enough attention from the international community are multiple. One is definitely that the international community focuses on crisis where violence is higher. Also, the scale of the humanitarian situation in Madagascar has not really been understood. Every year there are worse crises linked to natural disasters, and more than 70% of the population live under the poverty line. Madagascar is not considered as being part of Africa or Asia, but actually it's part of SADC and the African Union. And this is where the international community should focus and continue to help Madagascar.
So Lova, she says it's in this in-between place, in between Asia, Africa, and so not really of either. Do you agree with that?
Yes, actually, it's a conversation that's ongoing between Malagasy people themselves. They're not quite sure whether they should call themselves African or South Asian. I totally understand. I think we've been struggling, like Simon explained, to try to get people to relate to the tragedy that is here. And with what we've been doing as part of the Malagasy communities is that we've actually tried to grasp on what people are interested, the Madagascar, the cartoon, or Madagascar, the lemur, and try to say, okay, now that we got you, we want you to see at what the people are going through. And we've been trying to do that since the coup d'etat in 2009, but it's it's very difficult when people are looking at wanting to watch a Disney movie. It's not that easy a switch to suddenly go into drought and famine.
That's a hard gear change. When the movie came out, Lova, what was your first reaction?
I said, well, here come the lemurs, and it's what are you gonna do? I've been actually trying to actively fight this. It's not only about the lemurs, but at some point you just maybe I could use the lemur and get people to come, and then they'll see, okay, hey, Madagascar is also all of this.
What do we not understand about the people of Madagascar? What have we left out? We've talked a lot about the situation and malnutrition and issues with drought and issues with flooding. What about the people?
Well, what we don't understand, I think, is that just not one people of Madagascar. There's several peoples of Madagascar.
Exactly.
And that's always been lost in the story.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why we cannot address those what's going on in the south is that the peoples of Madagascar themselves do not know how to talk among each other. We're still quite divided in a lot of ways, and I think we need to start there.
Nima, what did you want to add?
Just when I said that the culture is really passive, I didn't mean that in necessarily a negative way. It is just difficult to have, like you said, those kinds of conversations when confrontation is not something that people are very inclined towards, and are not necessarily inclined to having any kind of conversations about something that could be perceived as tense or disrespectful to someone else.
Interesting. Willem, when you said you introduced yourself as the World Food Programme Country Director for Madagascar, and you're in charge of cyclones, drought, and what was the third thing that you're in charge of?
And cyclones, floods, and droughts. I think that's what I said.
Cyclones, floods, and drought. Okay.
Floods and droughts. Yeah.
Okay. What would we have to do in Madagascar to put you out of business? Like you'd have to go somewhere else because you had no more work to be done. How do I get you to retire?
That's our objective.
Yeah. Exactly. How do I get WFP? Like we're done now. We're moving on. What would have to happen?
Well, where can we start? There's so many priorities in this country that's another way of putting it. But I would think that we need to start investing more and more and more in governance and capacity building, really. Of course, there are humanitarian crises ongoing at the same time.
I'm going to stop you for a moment, because capacity building meaning what? Exactly.
Well, I said governance and capacity building.
Yeah.
So, governance means the whole structure of the government and local authorities, how it works. Also respecting traditional structures, which actually work quite well. But also capacity building. There's a lot of lack of, I would say, knowledge, information in different, technical institutions that are working in the country. And that needs to be built up. Those institutions have suffered enormously from those.
So give us an example.
crises.
I always find that things like capacity building is code for something, and I'm just trying to give me one example where people don't know enough and they're working in a particular area in Madagascar, and it's going to be more vivid if you actually nail it down for us, Willem.
Okay. Very, very specific. For example, for the drought and so on, it would be great if Madagascar could have an early warning system.
Yes.
Itself.
Yes, of course.
So
okay,
something
fine.
that would say, listen, this problem is coming, and these are the measures that we need to start taking right now, because otherwise we're going to have a major crisis. And the government and does not have it right now. It existed in the past.
And that's outrageous. That's outrageous, because you can see a cyclone coming across the Indian Ocean. You have the computers doing the modeling for the cyclone. Madagascar knows what's going to happen when a cyclone hits it, and yet you have these issues with cyclones ongoing. That is kind of unacceptable.
Yeah, but I was also talking about slow onset, emergencies. These ones, cyclones, when they come, they usually come from the Indian Ocean and give you a little bit of, 10 days warning.
Yeah, exactly.
But the last years, they've been coming from the Mozambican channel, and we only have 2 or 3 days warning, basically, to respond.
But you're in a tropical cyclone zone, so it should never be a surprise, any tropical cyclone season. You can tell I'm a former meteorologist. I will stop now, everybody, because it's an area that kind of upsets me, because at least you can prep for this. Nima, what did you want to say?
Well, I agree about the cyclones and the flooding, but even the Peace Corps, the organization I work for, sends a text out a couple of days. Look alive, there's a cyclone coming. The room to do anything tangible about it is really, really limited.
Yes, but there's a whole season ahead of time, Nima. You don't do something 3 days before. Well, there's some things you can do 3 days before, but how about 6 months before? Or how about a year before?
If I can give you an example, for example.
Yes.
Yeah. So, for example, what we try to do is preposition food. Food is going to be needed in an emergency.
Sure.
But there are not enough resources in this country to cover all the places. So you try to guess more or less what the places are going to be. They're going to be the worst hit, where who's going to have the worst impact, and that's where you go. But cyclones, they suddenly decide to come from the other side. If you take a look at a map of this Indian Ocean, you can see that the cyclones are crisscrossing this country all over the time. So it is difficult.
I understand. It's not an exact
resources.
science, and I understand this in a country that has limited resources. Let me just move on here and wrap up. Lova, what's your next story about Madagascar? What's it going to be?
If I can just say something, if you would take only like half the time to go from the southern region to the capital city, then organization like the WFP could take like just 5 hours to get food there. The issue to me is that there's not enough fast route or planes or bridges basically between regions. If it takes you always 2 days to go from one place to the other, then of course you're not going to be able to handle emergency crises as well as you should.
All right. I hear that obviously the solutions are complex and difficult to get to. But Lova and Nima and Simon and Willem, thank you so much for helping us understand Madagascar a lot better. We're much more educated 40 minutes on than when we started. That's thanks to you. Malika, what do you have?
This is the last word from a Malagasy writer on Twitter whose name is Soamili. That's his handle. As long as the Madagascar cycle is going on, nothing will improve. And by that cycle, he means the political crises that continue to pop up.
Guests, thank you very much for being part of the stream today. Appreciate it. Take care.